The first presenter is Hsueh. He's with Arup Architects and Engineers, based in California, right? And he's been doing PRT planning work in a number of cases, and he's going to tell us about the case that he and Laura Stashinsky are working on right now as we speak. He's just taking a short break from the work to present it to us. And the title of his presentation is San Jose Automated Guideway Transit Study. Gary, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm very honored to be sharing this with you today. This is the first time, and we have just been working on it this year. But it is an outgrowth of a study that we had started actually a few years ago. So we had completed a study for the City of San Jose and for the Valley Transportation Authority in San Jose, looking at connecting the San Jose Airport to adjacent light rail system and adjacent commuter rail system. So that was the previous study that was done and finished in 2012. And some of the insiders in the industry, they always poke fun at me because of the results of that study, which were that, basically we felt at the time that the risk was too high for a city agency, who has a very risk-averse profile to be supporting the technology. So that's why if you see people hitting me outside in the back, that's why. But in the meantime, we've been working on this study, which is a follow-up study, and it's still looking at the San Jose Airport, but it's also, during the course of the last study, we were saying, well, why not just connect the airport to the most important rail and transit station in Silicon Valley, which is Diridon Station, which you've heard about from Rod Diridon, as well as Ben Treposis earlier about talking about high-speed rail, because Diridon Station is going to be the future high-speed rail station in San Jose, as well as the future BART station, which connects to a whole regional network. What I've shown up here are also just a number of other transit services that terminate or serve Diridon. And so during the course of that study, it became very clear that we wanted to do this work, but just because of the funding constraint, we weren't able to look at it. So this study is much smaller, but it was looking at this very, very specific question about, well, how do you link the airport to Diridon Station? And so we were really honored to look at that. And, with the work that we had done previously, kind of focusing on the airport, we were able to take that and then now focus on that connection from the airport to Diridon Station. So Diridon Station is that circle near the bottom of the screen, and we've also looked at some other areas too. Kind of the add-on to the scope was, well, let's look at some of the areas. If you took the idea of ATN, an automated transit network, and really took the network portion of that and expanded it beyond just this trunk line that we were talking about, then what other ridership do you pick up? So from a transportation planning perspective, my role generally is more broad, and I tend to look at all different modes of transportation, ranging from walking and biking to public transit and PRT and AGT and in between. So what we wanted to do was also compare and identify what is the right role for ATN in this application. So for our client, we put together a very quick snapshot of different automated modes and kind of relative characteristics about them, just to kind of bracket where we might end up in terms of the ridership that we anticipated for this linkage, as well as for a broader network. So here we're just comparing, on the left-hand side, what the capacity and the speed, et cetera, is of an automated metro, moving to your automated people mover systems that, typically serve airports, but are still trains or, single cars moving on guideways, down to what ATNs are, including both GRT and PRT. So for us, it was, taking the transportation planning perspective and kind of stepping through, just thinking about, well, how do you get to the answer of what is the right technology to use and to recommend for this system? It's going through a number of steps, and I'll just go ahead and run down those steps. The first one is identifying what the daily ridership demand was. And so what's special about Diridon, is that high-speed rail connection. So we have a whole section related to how we estimated what that ridership might be. But we also took in the information we had before about the trips that are within the airport that also would be served. And so we're talking about connections between long-term parking and the terminals. And then here we're also looking at how much of that typical air travel, those air passengers, how many of those would use this system if they connected via Diridon. So if they took transit to Diridon and then took this system to the airport, how many of those people would do that? And what we found quickly is that a lot of it is based on how much ridership or how much air passenger for that first category, for just the air passengers. We found very widely differing estimates for the passenger forecast at San Jose Airport. So this is just illustrating that wide gap. The airport itself is predicting a very high rate of growth, and the Federal Aviation Administration was predicting a fairly low amount of growth. Another determinant is, for the ridership estimate was how accessible would the airport be if you added the ATN system. And so this is a picture of how far you can get today with all of the current transit services. We were able to analyze all the transit schedules in our tool and say, well, this is how far you can get. The green is showing how far you can get within a 45, or the yellow on there is how far you can get within a 45-minute transit trip using existing transit, and the blue is showing you how far you can get within an hour. So that means that 1/3 of the air passengers could conceivably take transit to the airport in 1 hour, and only 9% could do that within 45 minutes. And basically, with those distances that we're showing, that's not particularly competitive with automobile. With the auto trip, you're much less than that for those distances. So when we assumed that you could have some kind of AGT, automated guideway transit system, that really increases the accessibility of the airport by transit. So we double the number of people who would be within a 45-minute trip, and almost half of the people would be within a 1 hour. So I'm just going to flip back and forth. So this is before with today's conditions, and that's after. And that's just by adding this link between Diridon and the airport, because Diridon has so much more access to other transit services. So that kind of gets us to a comparison with the other airports in the region that have higher mode share for their connecting systems. SFO has the AirTrain system, and Oakland Airport has their new Oakland Airport Connector, which is a cable-pulled people mover system. And once we compare those mode shares of 6%, 6% of the air passengers and employees take those systems to get to the airport. We compare that to San Jose, which was just a bit more than half of, just about half of what the other systems were doing. So that led us to estimate, what might be possible if we had kind of that, if we bracketed what that mode share was for San Jose, and if we extrapolated that and said, well, this system is going to be just as good or better than those. So where does that put us in terms of the number of people who could possibly ride this system and who probably would ride it based on, how accessible the airport is? We also added in the data that we had from the previous study about how many people would be served between the airport terminals and the long-term parking. And then we also did this analysis of what happens when you actually do connect and when you have high-speed rail serving Diridon Station. What are the synergies between those people who are taking high-speed rail from the Central Valley? And so what we did was looking at the amount of air service that's available in the Central Valley is very low. And so actually having, because high-speed rail, we learned earlier, high-speed rail would connect you from the Central Valley to San Jose in just an hour. And that's actually much more reasonable than it is today. So we thought, some of those air passengers in Central Valley would probably come to San Jose and fly to their destinations if they had this high-speed rail link. Not all of them would, and some of them would even eventually go up to SFO if they wanted to catch the longer, long-haul international flights. So we kind of cut down, kind of systematically thought about which passengers we might get. But this is not estimated in the California High-Speed Rail Authority's travel demand model. This is an additional component that we thought was missing. So that was kind of a fun exercise for us to do. So that's the number of people we were estimating is in the yellow number up there. And we also thought about, well, how many high-speed rail passengers could, possibly park at the airport in order to ride high-speed rail? So there's that component of people. And also, how many high-speed rail passengers who wanted to rent a car could actually go to the airport to rent a car there, because there's an entire parking structure full of rental cars. So why not have that synergy with the airport uses? So we've also estimated some numbers for those supporting uses. So the summary then is that we actually had a fairly large number, we think, of potential passengers on a per day basis. Especially, and so that's kind of the 6,700 to 11,800. That's kind of all of these things, not counting the intra-airport trips, the people who park at long-term parking. Once you add those, that we're really talking about 18,000 to 24,000, and that's roughly equivalent to the bus rapid transit system that is in Santa Clara Valley, the VTA El Camino Real 522 Rapid. So that's actually, I thought, a pretty interesting observation. Now just breaking it down into, taking that daily number and putting it across the time of days. Because of the airport schedule and the high-speed rail schedule, it's actually pretty evenly balanced throughout the day, and I think that's an important characteristic. And then once you kind of put that out on a per link basis and try to estimate, then break it down. What segment is the busiest one that we have to plan for in terms of the capacity of a system? Taking all of that, we end up with a number on the right-hand side, which is about 600 people per direction per hour. And that meets up quite nicely with the capacity of a PRT system. Even the system at Heathrow, for example, or the To Get There system, with these kinds of numbers, we don't need to be looking beyond. We don't need to be looking for a larger GRT system or even an automated people mover system. We don't need that air train system that could be much more expensive. And so we also did a comparison of potential costs between what this AGT/PRT system could be, as opposed to actual costs of airport people mover systems elsewhere, particularly the Oakland Airport Connector, which is a very, very new system, as well as the one in Phoenix. And looking at their costs, the size of their system, and breaking it down to a cost per passenger. We thought that might be a good metric, the cost per new passenger, capital cost. So if you take the overall cost of their system and divide it by the overall ridership on a daily basis, you get approximately $70,000 to $150,000 per passenger. And whereas with an AGT system, we'd be looking at a much lower cost per person. So I thought that was a very important observation. So just to go to the expanded network, we did want to think and consider broader areas in the Silicon Valley region. And made some assumptions about where you could possibly go so that we're not directly competing with light rail, but we're also using light rail system as a complement to this so that we could connect to it, but also serve other areas. And we were using the region's travel demand model to understand how many people and jobs are within these colored areas. To end up with a ridership matrix of all these different areas on the left, and how they connect to all the other areas, how many people of each kind or each passenger type, whether it's air passengers or if it's people just using transit generally. Yeah, those are that kind of explains the different colors. And kind of in the format that I showed earlier, when you just take the total, there is we found a modest increase in passenger ridership when we included that broader area. Importantly, it does not include a certain category which would be much more difficult to estimate, unless my colleagues would have a very good way of doing it, they might. But there's an additional, if you do have a larger network that expands many large areas, there might be additional ridership that you could gain that we did not analyze. That was just kind of beyond the scope of our study. But looking at that broader network, we also did the same exercise of, okay, let's break it down to the daily ridership by segment, as well as hourly. And the hourly is that line that we're using to compare. And we're still in that, we're still in that range of, PRT could work. It could work quite well for the demand. And in terms of cost, because we have, we were estimating a small increment in increased ridership compared to a much larger network. The costs per passenger would be higher with this expanded network, but it would still be at least within the range or lower than comparable than the airport people mover systems. So I think, all of this analysis is kind of, I've been going about it without saying that, obviously the passenger experience for PRT would be a lot better than I think some of the systems that we're comparing to in terms of the on-demand service, the point-to-point service, and I think what we were able to add to this discussion was just that even when you compare costs against other systems, with this kind of, stepping through these different ridership types we hope that's a good contribution. So thank you very much.